Have you ever found yourself in the garden dirt under your fingernails, heart and mind wandering back through time only to be interrupted by a phone call that changes the shape of your entire world? My name is Charlotte Ellis, and if you've ever been caught between what you thought you knew and what life reveals in the quietest moments, this story might feel a little bit like your own. The morning my grandmother Evelyn passed away began like any other cool sunlight drifting across the roses, the kind she always said could outlive any winter. She believed in starting over in second blooms, in the hope buried just beneath old soil. I never knew, kneeling in that garden, that I was already standing at the edge of the most complicated truth my family had ever kept. When my phone buzzed that morning, I wiped the dirt from my hands and answered without a second thought. A calm, unfamiliar voice introduced himself as Thomas Grant, my grandmother's attorney, and in that gentle way people say for bad news, he told me she was gone. There's a kind of silence that follows news like that, a hush that seems to settle over your life all at once. But what he said next pulled me back from my memories. Charlotte, your grandmother, left explicit instructions. She wanted you to be the first to know, and she has a letter for you. She asked that you come to my office today before anyone else in the family is informed. Suddenly, the air felt heavy, and even the roses seemed to hold their breath. What could Evelyn have needed to say from beyond the quiet comfort of her last day? You have to understand, my grandmother wasn't like anyone else in our family. To the outside world, Evelyn Carter was all elegance and gentle smiles, the matriarch who built her business from nothing, the woman who donated to every charity, who made each holiday feel magical. But behind closed doors, with just the two of us and the hum of the old kitchen clock, she was full of quiet mischief and fierce wisdom. She taught me how to bake bread and how to spot a lie. She showed me how to keep a secret, and just as importantly, when to let one go. Her greatest lesson, she always said, was that truth is like a rose. It blooms when it's ready, even if you try to prune it back. All that day, as I drove through the city to Mr. Grant's office, every memory seemed brighter, every regret sharper. The city skyline, the familiar streets, even the old estate gates, everything felt like a test I hadn't studied for. I wondered what Evelyn had trusted me with. Why me, the quiet granddaughter who had always felt more like an observer than a participant at family gatherings? Maybe she knew something I didn't. Or maybe, as she'd once whispered over a cup of tea, every family needs a keeper, someone to hold the truth until it's time to let it grow. By the time I reached the law office, my heart was pounding. The waiting room was all dark wood and leather-bound books, a world away from the sunlight and earth outside. Mr. Grant greeted me with the careful sympathy of a man who's given bad news many times before. But as he slid a cream-colored envelope across the desk, a letter with my name in Evelyn's beautiful script, he said, "Your grandmother believed you were the only one who could do what must be done." In that moment, holding her words in my hands, I felt the weight of both a blessing and a burden. I was about to inherit not just her memories, but her secrets, and perhaps the hardest choice our family would ever face. Before I read that letter, I want to take you back not just to the moment of loss, but to all the ordinary days that led here. Because every family secret starts as a whisper, a half-truth buried in kindness, a look exchanged across a dinner table. And every act of courage, I think, begins in those quiet, overlooked moments, the ones where you realize that telling the truth might cost you everything, but keeping silent would cost you even more. As I unfolded my grandmother's letter, the words seemed to rise off the page. "Charlotte, what you do next will change our family forever. Trust yourself and trust the roses. They know when it's time to bloom." So if you've ever wondered what it means to carry both love and legacy, to be the person everyone turns to when the past finally knocks on the door, I hope you'll stay with me. Because this story isn't just about secrets. It's about finding the courage to speak, the grace to forgive, and the strength to start anew. And maybe, just maybe, it's about the beauty that can rise from even the darkest soil when someone is finally ready to let the truth come to light. There's something almost sacred about the rituals we keep with those we love, small traditions that turn into anchors, holding us steady when life's current grows unpredictable. For me, those anchors were always the hours spent in my grandmother Evelyn's garden, learning the names of each rose and how to coax even the shyest bud to bloom. The day she passed, I found myself returning to that old garden almost without thinking, my hands deep in the earth, hoping that if I just kept planting, kept tending, I could keep her close a little while longer. The sun was gentle that morning, dappling the grass with gold. As I tucked a Queen Anne rose, her favorite, into the soil, I thought about how she'd once told me roses will always forgive a harsh winter if you give them patience. I didn't know yet that I would soon need to forgive a winter far colder than any that had come before. The call came just as I was dusting my hands on my jeans. I barely registered the unfamiliar number before answering, expecting perhaps a neighbor or a friend with condolences. But instead, the measured tone of Thomas Grant, my grandmother's attorney, delivered a message I thought I was prepared for, but wasn't. Evelyn was gone. I stood silent in the garden, the world suddenly quieter. Then, in words that barely fit inside the air between us, he told me she'd left instructions just for me, a letter, a request, and a promise that I'd understand in time. There's a special kind of shock that comes with losing someone whose wisdom shaped your every season. It's as if time itself tilts, and you're left holding all the unspoken words, the stories that will now only ever belong to you. On the drive to Mr. Grant's office, I kept thinking about those stories, how every family, no matter how loving, keeps its own patch of secrets tucked away like fragile seedlings. Sometimes those secrets are small, a recipe hidden in a worn cookbook, a nickname only spoken between two people in a crowded room. But sometimes, as I was about to learn, those secrets are more like roots twisted deep, shaping everything that grows above them. In America, we like to believe that truth is simple, that families are built on honesty, but anyone who's lived through a will reading or a holiday dinner knows that's rarely the case. In fact, one of my old college roommates once told me about her own family's unraveling after her grandfather's funeral, when an unexpected heir appeared with documents everyone thought had been lost. The fallout split the family for years, not because of money, but because of the secrets money exposed. The memory of that story clung to me as I entered the law office, a grand space filled with reminders of tradition, heavy wood, thick carpets, the faint scent of lemon polish. Mr. Grant greeted me gently, his eyes holding a sympathy I wasn't ready to accept. When he handed me the cream envelope, I recognized Evelyn's looping handwriting immediately. It felt almost wrong to break the seal, as if opening it would make her absence real. But I remembered her words from so many years ago. Some truths need the right hands to carry them. She must have believed mine were strong enough, even if I wasn't sure. I slid the letter from the envelope, bracing myself for whatever came next. Inside, Evelyn's words were direct, loving, and heavy with purpose. She wrote about her faith in me, about the courage it takes to do the right thing when it's hardest. But she also wrote about her own regrets, the ways silence can grow like weeds, choking out the flowers we mean to plant. In her graceful way, she explained there was a secret she could no longer keep hidden, and she asked me as her final wish to be the one to bring it into the light. This isn't about revenge, she wrote, but about healing. Our family can't truly begin again until we know what soil we're growing in. I could almost hear her voice as I read, gentle but insistent. The lesson was clear. Sometimes love means telling the truth even when it hurts. After reading the letter, I sat for a long time in that office, watching dust dance in the late morning sun. I thought of all the times I'd chosen silence for the sake of peace, biting my tongue at tense dinners, smoothing over sharp words for the sake of keeping the family together. But sitting there, holding Evelyn's words, I realized there's a difference between keeping peace and planning denial. The first allows for growth, for new blossoms to appear each spring. The second stifles everything until the garden withers under secrets too heavy to bear. That was Evelyn's lesson, tucked between lines of love and apology. Truth is what lets us grow, not just as individuals, but as a family. By the time I left the office, the city felt different, both familiar and new, like a home you see from a different angle after years away. The envelope weighed less in my purse, but more in my heart. I wondered what the rest of my family would think, how they would feel when I brought Evelyn's secret into the open. Would they be angry, relieved? Would old wounds finally heal, or would new ones split open? I didn't have answers yet, but I remembered another lesson from Evelyn's garden. When you plant something new, you can't always see how deep the roots will go. I promised myself I would honor her wish, even if the cost was greater than I could see. That night back at home, I sat by my kitchen window with the letter in my lap, watching dusk fall over the roses outside. In a way, I felt closer to Evelyn than I had in years, not because she'd left me her legacy, but because she'd trusted me with her hardest truth. There's power in being chosen, even when the task feels impossible. Before I went to bed, I wrote a single sentence in my journal. Tomorrow I'll find out just how much light one truth can bring. It was a promise to her and to myself. And as I drifted into sleep, I realized something important. Sometimes the first step toward healing isn't forgiveness or closure, but the willingness to look honestly at what's been hidden and to step forward even when the path ahead is uncertain. That's where this story truly begins, not in the keeping of secrets, but in the brave act of bringing them into the sun. In the days that followed, that bravery would be tested as the garden of our family, like all gardens, faced its own long winter and waited for spring. The day after meeting with Mr. Grant, I moved through my house as if underwater, each motion weighted by the promise I'd made to Evelyn, and by the fear of what I might discover. I kept returning to her words. You must bring the truth into the light. But what would that truth cost? I'd grown up in a family that prided itself on its public image holiday cards. With coordinated sweaters, grand reunions at the old estate speeches at charity galas, where the Carter name meant something beyond money. Yet beneath the shine, there were always shadows, little rifts papered over by tradition disagreements, smoothed with forced laughter. Now Evelyn's letter suggested those shadows ran deeper than I ever guessed. It left me wondering just how much of our legacy was built on trust and how much on silence. As I read and reread her instructions, a wave of doubt washed over me. Why me? I whispered into the quiet. I wasn't the eldest grandchild, nor the most successful. I didn't run a business or hold a law degree. I was just Charlotte, the one who listened, who remembered birthdays, who knew how Evelyn liked her tea. Maybe that was the point. Maybe she'd chosen the family's quiet observer because I would feel the responsibility most deeply, or because I wouldn't turn away when faced with something difficult. I remembered a story I once heard on the radio about a woman in Vermont who discovered an old family secret buried in the attic, a set of letters that revealed her grandfather had supported a cause he'd spent his life denying. In the end, it wasn't the family's most powerful member who brought the truth forward, but the one most willing to listen. Sometimes the courage to face what's hidden belongs to those who never expected to lead. My grandmother's instructions were precise. Before you tell anyone else, she wrote, you must retrieve what I've left in my jewelry box, the one with the rosewood inlay. You remember how to open the secret compartment. As I pictured the box tucked away in her bedroom, I was flooded by a dozen childhood memories sitting on her bed, tracing the inlaid petals with my fingers listening, as she told stories about each piece inside. Every jewel, she'd say, has a secret. The trick is knowing which ones are worth revealing. I always thought she meant childhood games or perhaps a lesson about honesty. Now it was clear she had been preparing me for something much bigger. It took a day before I gathered the nerve to return to Evelyn's home, the old estate just beyond the city's edge. The house was still and reverent, wrapped in the hush that follows a loss. Mrs. Langley, the housekeeper, met me at the door, her eyes rimmed red from crying. She wanted you to have access to everything, she said, softly pressing the bedroom key into my palm. I thanked her and climbed the stairs, each step echoing in the empty hallway. In the bedroom, sunlight slanted through floral curtains, casting patterns on the polished floor. There on the dresser stood the rosewood jewelry box, just as I remembered. My hands trembled as I traced the familiar design and found the hidden catch third petal from the left, just as Evelyn had taught me. Inside the secret compartment was another envelope heavier than expected with my name written in her hand. For a long moment, I just stared at it, thinking about all the times I'd wished my life were simpler. There's a peculiar kind of loneliness in holding a secret you never asked for. I thought of an old friend who'd been made executor of her aunt's will, a job she'd accepted without knowing it meant unearthing debts and betrayals that nearly tore her family apart. She once told me, no one warns you how isolating it feels to be the one who knows. I understood that now. Even surrounded by the scent of Evelyn's favorite lavender, I felt a world away from everyone else. I slipped the envelope into my bag, resisting the urge to open it right there. Some part of me wanted to believe that if I waited, I could put off whatever reckoning lay ahead. But Evelyn's trust was too sacred to delay. I sat on her bed, breathing in the scent of her perfume, remembering the little ways she'd guided me growing up, the gentle corrections, the private praise. She believed that real love meant asking more from each other, even when it was uncomfortable. That was her lesson to me always. Don't hide from what needs to be faced, Charlotte. If you do, you'll wake up one day and find that the hiding has become your whole life. I understood now that this was about more than our family's reputation. It was about breaking a cycle of silence. As I prepared to leave, I caught sight of an old photograph on the nightstand, Evelyn as a young woman standing before the original Carter business hope, in her smile, determination in her posture. Next to her stood my father William, barely older than I was now, and a third figure I didn't recognize. Something about the way they stood together, but not quite at ease, hinted at stories left untold. I slipped the photograph into my pocket, feeling that I'd need it soon. That's the thing about family secrets, they rarely stay buried, not when there's someone left who cares enough to look. Driving home, my mind raced with questions. What would my father say when he found out I'd been named the keeper of Evelyn's last wish? Would he try to stop me, or would he finally confess what he'd never spoken aloud? These were worries for tomorrow. For now, I focused on what Evelyn had asked, retrieving the truth and preparing to share it with those who needed to hear it most. I thought again of my friend in Vermont who told her story at a local town hall. You never know who needs your honesty, she'd said, but you always know when you need it for yourself. Before bed that night, I wrote another line in my journal. Sometimes the most important legacies aren't the ones written in wills, but the ones written in courage. That became my small lesson for the day. If you find yourself holding a truth no one else dares to speak, it might just mean you're the only one who can carry it forward. With Evelyn's envelope locked away for the night, I felt a cautious resolve beginning to grow. I wasn't sure what I would find inside: scandal, heartbreak, or something stranger still, but I knew I wouldn't face it alone. Even in her absence, my grandmother's love was a lantern in the dark. As I drifted off to sleep, I promised myself that whatever happened next, I would meet it with the same patience and faith she'd shown me in the garden. After all, tomorrow would be the day I'd read her last secret, and the day our family's true story would finally begin to surface. Early the next morning, with the house still wrapped in silence and my thoughts restless from too little sleep, I placed Evelyn's sealed envelope on the kitchen table and sat down beside it. The world felt both ordinary and forever changed. I poured myself a cup of tea, Evelyn's favorite blend, chamomile and rose, and tried to gather the courage I needed. There was comfort in these rituals, the way small acts of care could soften the edges of worry. In moments like this, I often remembered how as a child I would sit on her porch steps and listen to stories about her youth, her early days building the Carter family business, and her stubborn belief that honesty, even in small things, mattered more than any quick fix. The truth will always find a way, she'd say, but it goes easier if you help it along. The weight of her trust felt almost physical now, sitting quietly across from me on the table. With steady hands, I broke the wax seal on the envelope and unfolded Evelyn's letter. Each word was like a doorway to the past, some passages written with tenderness, others with the hard-earned clarity of regret. She began by reminding me of the day she first taught me to open her jewelry box's secret compartment when I was just 12 years old. I wanted you to know how to find what matters most, she wrote, because sometimes the things we hide are the things we most need to see. Her instructions were clear. Inside the hidden compartment, I would find documents, photographs, and a second letter, one that must be read only when the entire family was gathered together. As I read, my heart pounded with equal parts, dread and hope. There was a purpose to this challenge, but also a warning. Be gentle with yourself, Charlotte. Some truths sting before they heal. I returned to Evelyn's estate later that day, the sunlight now warm and insistent filtering through the old oaks that lined the drive. Mrs. Langley met me at the door and offered a comforting smile, her eyes betraying a lifetime of loyalty. She trusted you most," she whispered. Those words settled around my shoulders, both a comfort and a burden. Upstairs, the bedroom was just as I'd left it, neat, fragrant, with the scent of dried roses and awash in the soft light that always made the room feel like a sanctuary. I crossed to the dresser, my fingers brushing the carved rosewood jewelry box. The mechanism was familiar, third pedal from the left, a gentle push, and then the quiet click as the false bottom slid open. It was a small miracle that something so delicate could remain hidden for so long, proof perhaps that the simplest secrets are often the hardest to uncover. Inside the compartment, nestled between old velvet and lavender sachets, was a heavy packet tied with blue ribbon. There were photographs aged and curling at the corners of Evelyn, and two men I only vaguely recognized, one of whom I realized with a start was my own father in his 20s, his expression both proud and wary. The second man's face was unfamiliar, but striking his eyes, carrying a kindness that seemed out of place in so formal a portrait. Beneath the photographs were yellowed newspaper clippings, copies of business contracts, and handwritten notes. I ran my hand over them gently, half afraid they'd crumble at my touch. The second letter, addressed simply, "To my family," sat at the bottom of the box. My breath caught. I knew without reading that this was the secret Evelyn needed me to share. Sometimes the act of discovery feels like walking a tightrope between relief and heartbreak. I thought of a documentary I'd seen once about a woman who inherited her grandmother's farmhouse and uncovered a trunk full of unsent love letters in the attic. Those letters, never meant for anyone but the writer and her absent sweetheart, told the real story of a marriage of sacrifices and private sorrows never spoken aloud. The granddaughter faced a choice: protect the myth of the perfect couple or honor the truth that shaped their lives. In the end, she chose honesty, even though it meant reimagining everything she thought she knew about her family. As I looked at Evelyn's collection of evidence, I felt the same responsibility, the need to honor not only the past, but the present and the future it would help shape. With the packet in my hands, I sat on the bed and allowed myself to grieve not just for Evelyn, but for the family we'd been before secrets divided us. There was sorrow for the innocence lost, but also gratitude for the trust she'd placed in me. In that moment, I realized that the real legacy Evelyn left behind was not money or property, but the courage to question, to seek to reveal. My lesson, learned quietly in her sunlit bedroom, was that love is not about keeping things hidden for the sake of comfort, but about making space for difficult truths so that healing can begin. As the afternoon waned, I tucked the packet safely into my bag, knowing that soon I would have to face my family with all I had learned. Before leaving, I took one last look around Evelyn's room, her favorite book stacked by the chair, a faded afghan draped across the bed, a vase of Queen Anne roses catching the last light. I thought about how a single secret buried for decades could change so much. Yet I also believed that new traditions could bloom where old wounds were finally acknowledged. With every step down the hallway, I felt a little more certain, a little less afraid of what lay ahead. Sometimes the hardest stories to tell are the ones most needed. That night at home, I placed the evidence and the family letter in the center of my desk and wrote again in my journal. Uncovering the past is never easy, but it's the only way forward. My resolve, though shaky, was real. I would keep Evelyn's promise. Tomorrow, I'd begin the hardest part, inviting my family into the truth, and hoping that what we found together would be enough to start something new. With that hope, I finally closed my eyes, trusting that just as Evelyn had promised, even the oldest wounds can heal if given sunlight and patience. The days leading up to Evelyn's funeral were filled with a strange stillness, as if the house itself was holding its breath, bracing for a storm that everyone knew was coming, but no one dared to name. While I moved quietly through preparations, choosing music, confirming guests, arranging for Evelyn's favorite roses, I felt the tension humming beneath the surface of every conversation. My father, William, grew uncharacteristically restless. He called me 3 times in one morning, his tone jumping between forced cheer and sharp-edged questions about the will, about what Evelyn had left, about why the lawyer had been so secretive. My Aunt Martha, ever the diplomat in public, sent long emails about honoring tradition and avoiding unnecessary drama. Even Tyler, my cousin, who had once confided in me his own doubts about the family legacy, was suddenly distant, his texts clipped and formal. It's a peculiar truth, one that Americans know well from news stories, and sometimes their own experience, that money more than any other force can split a family down to its roots. I remembered an article I'd read not long ago about the famous Johnson family in Connecticut, who had spent decades fighting over a trust left by their patriarch. The battles weren't just about money, they were about old wounds, about who felt seen and who felt left behind. I saw hints of that same bitterness flickering behind the polite faces at our own dinner table. What was once laughter was now replaced by silences, and old alliances re-emerged in subtle, unspoken ways. I realized that Evelyn's secret, whatever it was pressing on the fault lines that had always run through us. On the night before the funeral, we gathered at the estate for what was supposed to be a peaceful family meal. The air was thick with unasked questions. My father sat at the head of the table, his fingers drumming against the wood eyes, darting from one face to another. Martha filled the silences with stories from the past, but they fell flat, everyone too distracted to really listen. Tyler barely touched his food, glancing at me whenever he thought I wasn't looking. After dessert, as we lingered in the parlor, my father finally broke the spell. "Charlotte?" he said, voice just above a whisper. "Do you know what's in the will?" The question hung in the air. I shook my head, careful to keep my tone neutral, even as my heart raced. "We'll all find out together tomorrow, Dad." That's what Evelyn wanted. The lesson of that evening was both simple and painful families are strongest when they trust each other, but trust is the first thing to vanish when the stakes are high. As I listened to my relatives tiptoe around the truth, I realized how often we mistake peace for harmony. Real harmony isn't about pretending everything's fine. It's about having the courage to face what's broken and to talk honestly, even when it hurts. In America, this lesson echoes everywhere, from boardrooms to backyards, wherever people try to hold on to appearances at the expense of what matters. Sometimes, we spend so much energy avoiding conflict that we let small misunderstandings fester into lifelong grievances. After everyone left, I wandered through the empty halls, the laughter from childhood echoing like a distant song. I passed the family photographs that lined the walls, birthdays, graduations, summer picnics, smiling faces, each one hiding a story that might never be told. I thought of my college friend Jennifer, who once confessed that her family hadn't spoken in years after a dispute over their grandmother's quilt collection. It wasn't about the quilt she'd sighed, it was about who got to feel remembered. I finally understood what she meant. Sometimes it isn't the object that matters, but the sense of belonging it represents. Back in my room, I looked again at the evidence Evelyn had left, the photos, the letter to be read at the funeral, and the documents that held the real shape of our legacy. I felt the burden and privilege of being trusted with the truth. I wrote in my journal, a family is more than its history. It's the stories we choose to share and those we finally let go. I promised myself that whatever happened tomorrow, I would not run from what needed to be said. I would honor Evelyn not just by keeping her secrets, but by setting them free, and by refusing to let fear or rivalry write our story's ending. Lying in bed, I replayed the strained conversations and thought about how many American families find themselves at crossroads just like this, caught between what they hope to inherit and what they need to heal. In the soft darkness, I saw Evelyn's garden in my mind, every rosebush, a testament to patience and renewal, each thorn, a reminder that beauty often comes with risk. I understood that tomorrow's truth-telling would change everything, but maybe, just maybe, it would give us a chance to plant something new. With that hope blooming quietly in my heart, I closed my eyes and let the night carry me forward, ready to face the dawn and the reckoning that would come with it. Tomorrow at the funeral, the story would finally break open, and in its telling, perhaps we would find a way back to one another. On the morning of Evelyn's funeral, a gentle mist clung to the gardens, softening the old estate into something almost dreamlike. The house was busier than I'd seen it in years, relatives arriving in dark suits, old friends greeting one another with subdued hugs, the staff quietly moving through the rooms with respectful efficiency. Everywhere there were flowers arrangements of Evelyn's beloved Queen Anne roses and sprays of white lilies, their perfume threading through the air, as if to remind us that life and beauty can coexist with loss. I stood at the window for a moment watching the family gather by the chapel doors. It struck me that rituals like these, however formal or familiar, are not only for the one who has gone, but for those of us left behind, giving us something to hold on to when the rest feels too uncertain to touch. As we filed into the chapel, I felt the weight of Evelyn's letter against my heart, tucked safely in my bag. I took my place at the front close to the altar, crowded with roses and framed photos from her life. There was one of her at 16, all hope and mischief, and another of her standing proudly beside the first Carter Company office. I wondered how many secrets lay behind those smiling eyes. The minister spoke with warmth, recounting stories from Evelyn's long life, her achievements, her generosity, her unwavering belief in the power of family. It was a beautiful eulogy, and yet as I looked around, I could feel the tension in the pews. My father's jaw set tight, Aunt Martha dabbing her eyes while stealing glances at her phone, Tyler shifting in his seat. Even in the presence of so much love, the questions lingered: what would become of us? After this day, would our bonds hold or snap beneath the strain of what was to come? The time soon arrived for the reading of Evelyn's last wishes. Mr. Grant, the family attorney, stepped to the podium, his calm presence a steadying force. He spoke about Evelyn's devotion, her sharp mind, her desire to leave behind a legacy that would matter for generations. Then, with a quiet nod in my direction, he invited me forward. My legs felt heavy as I walked up the aisle, each step a reminder of the promise I'd made. I turned to face my family, and all those gathered a sea of familiar and unfamiliar faces, every eye fixed on me. I could feel the hush that settled over the room, the collective holding of breath. In that moment, I remembered something Evelyn used to say whenever she asked me to speak the truth, even if my voice shook. Sometimes the hardest stories to tell are the ones that heal us most. With trembling hands, I opened her letter and began to read. Evelyn's words flowed through me clear and unwavering. She described her journey not only as a businesswoman and matriarch, but as someone who had carried a secret for far too long. She spoke of mistakes made in youth, of choices shaped by fear and love, and of her belief that a family's strength comes not from its perfection, but from its willingness to face the truth together. I read every word, careful not to leave anything out. As I spoke, I saw tears on more than one face, and even my father's hard expression began to soften just a little. The truth, I realized, can break us open, but it can also let light in where it's needed most. Evelyn's confession was not a simple one. She wrote of a partnership, a friendship that had formed the foundation of our family's fortune, one that had been betrayed in the pursuit of control and pride. She admitted to her own silence to years spent guarding a secret that had cost more than money could ever repair. As the details unfolded, names, dates, the painful admission of responsibility, a ripple passed through the chapel. For a moment, I feared that the truth would do nothing but wound, that it might break what little peace we had left. But as I finished the letter, I saw something else, a quiet kind of relief on some faces, as if the air had shifted and the burden of not knowing was finally gone. It made me think of a story I'd heard about a family in Ohio divided for decades by an old grudge, only to be reunited when the youngest member found an unopened letter in a box of her late mother's belongings. That letter explained everything: misunderstandings, regrets, lost opportunities for forgiveness. The truth didn't erase the hurt, but it allowed them to start talking again, to rebuild from a place of honesty. I realized then that the rituals of funerals and the sharing of secrets serve the same purpose. They invite us to remember to grieve, and if we're lucky, to begin again. After the service, people gathered in small groups, talking quietly, sharing memories, some weeping, some simply sitting in silence. My father approached, his eyes uncertain, as if he were seeing me for the first time. "You did the right thing, Charlotte," he whispered, though his voice was thick with old wounds. I felt a surge of hope. Perhaps in telling the truth, I had offered my family a chance at something new. As the day faded, I promised myself to hold on to that hope. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now there was relief in knowing that even heavy truths can make room for healing. As the sun set and the last guests departed, I lingered in the garden among Evelyn's roses. Their fragrance was bittersweet, and for the first time, I saw them not only as a reminder of what had been lost, but as a symbol of what might still be possible. With the truth finally spoken, I felt lighter, though the road ahead was far from certain. I looked toward the house where my family waited, and realized that this was only the beginning. The next part of our story, one built on honesty rather than illusion, was about to unfold. After the service, the air in the house felt different, lighter in some ways, heavier in others. People whispered in corners, processing the secrets Evelyn had finally let out into the open. I slipped away to the library, needing a moment to breathe. As the afternoon sun painted long rectangles across the floor, I replayed the words I had read Evelyn's confession echoing in my mind. Her story was no ordinary family dispute. It was a reckoning with the past, a testament to the tangled roots beneath our carefully pruned family tree. She had spoken honestly about a friendship betrayed, about a business partnership destroyed for pride and control, about documents signed in desperation, and a silence that had stretched for decades. The full weight of it pressed on me not just the shock of Evelyn's choices, but the realization that the person who lost the most wasn't in our family at all. Her business partner, the man whose ideas had helped build everything, had died with his share of the dream quietly taken from him. Evelyn's regret was plain. She had tried to make amends in her own ways, supporting his daughter anonymously and pouring her energy into causes he believed in. But as she wrote in her letter, you cannot build a legacy on silence and expect it to hold. I thought of how many American companies and families have faced similar reckonings, truths hidden for years finally revealed by a single brave voice. Scandals at old banks, the confessions of business founders, the reckoning that comes when stories too long buried finally surface. As family members filtered into the library, my father, Martha Tyler, a few others, their faces were marked by confusion, fear, even relief. My father's posture was rigid, but his eyes betrayed him. I could see the toll the truth had taken and the battle raging inside him between old loyalties and the freedom of finally being able to stop pretending. Martha broke the silence first, her voice brittle. How could she keep this from us for so long? Tyler stared at the floor, hands shaking. Maybe she thought she was protecting us, he murmured. The room felt fragile, like a glass ornament that could shatter with one wrong word. I remembered something I'd read in a memoir by a journalist whose family was torn apart by secrets, how for years their family gatherings were defined by what went unsaid, by the stories everyone knew, but no one dared acknowledge. The healing, she wrote, only began the day someone spoke aloud the truth, even though it broke hearts. It allowed space for anger, grief, and eventually forgiveness. Sitting in Evelyn's library, I realized how true that was. Our pain was raw, but it was real. For the first time in years, we could actually talk about what had happened instead of tiptoeing around it. I tried to explain as gently as I could why Evelyn had chosen to wait so long. She wanted to keep the family together. She thought she was protecting us. But in the end, it was the silence that hurt the most. My father's eyes filled with tears he fought to hide. I wish I'd known. I wish I'd had the chance to make it right with her, he whispered. That was the lesson that Evelyn had tried to teach us. Even the best intentions can have lasting consequences if they keep us from the truth. There's a saying I once heard from a therapist: family secrets are like seeds planted in the dark. Left alone, they grow into something twisted. Brought into the light, they can finally wither. It rang true now. I looked at Tyler, who offered a shaky but genuine smile. At least now we know who we really are, not just who we thought we were supposed to be. In that moment, I realized that the courage to face our own flaws is the only way families ever become whole. A practical detail awaited us. Still, Evelyn's will had left clear instructions for making amends to her business partner's daughter, Ava Harrington. I promised to reach out to her to explain everything as best I could. The room quieted, a subtle relief passing between us. Perhaps for the first time we would be able to write a new story together. Before the conversation ended, Martha squeezed my hand. "You did the right thing, Charlotte. It takes guts to tell the truth, especially when it costs you something." As the afternoon faded to evening, I wandered outside to Evelyn's rose garden, breathing in the scent of flowers blooming through late spring. I thought about how Evelyn had always insisted on pruning her roses in the harshest months, believing that only by cutting back what was diseased or overgrown could new buds flourish. Our family, too, was in the middle of its own difficult pruning, a painful process, but one that might finally allow us to grow again. I sat beneath the Climbing Roses journal in hand and wrote, "Confession doesn't erase the past, but it gives us the power to change the future." I knew the coming days would not be easy. Old resentments wouldn't disappear overnight, and forgiveness would be a slow and personal journey for each of us. But the hardest part, bringing the truth into the open, was finally behind us. Now came the work of rebuilding, of reaching out to those hurt by the secrets we'd carried of tending the family garden so that something new and honest could take root. With the first stars rising over the estate, I stood up and walked back to the house, ready for whatever conversations and challenges tomorrow would bring. The next part of the story would not be about endings, but about second chances and the difficult, beautiful work of healing. And in the quiet, I felt Evelyn's spirit gentle and steady, encouraging me to keep moving forward one step at a time. The days after the funeral felt as if the world had slowed to a strange, heavy crawl. Our house, once noisy with the comings and goings of cousins and old friends, was now filled with the kind of silence that comes only after something important has shattered. My father barely spoke, disappearing for hours into his study where the low sound of old records drifted through the closed door. Martha spent her time in the garden, tending to Evelyn's roses, as if the answer to every unspoken question could be found in the perfect bloom. Even Tyler, who had always been the first to crack a joke and lighten the mood, seemed older, quieter, his laughter replaced with thoughtful pauses. The confession had changed all of us. We moved through the days like people learning to walk again after a long illness, uncertain, but trying each step a small act of courage. I often found myself replaying every conversation I'd had with Evelyn in those final months, searching for clues, for signs that she had wanted to tell me more, but hadn't found the words. There's an ache in knowing that someone you loved carried such a heavy burden alone. I understood now why she had waited, why she had chosen her moment carefully, but I couldn't help but wonder if it might have been easier somehow if the truth had come out sooner. It reminded me of a story I'd heard about a family in Michigan whose patriarch had hidden a secret first marriage for 50 years. When it was finally revealed, it caused an uproar, but the grandchildren who never knew they had cousins were ultimately grateful. It hurt, one had said in an interview, but now we don't have to keep guessing. We know who we are. In our own way, we were learning that same lesson: truth can sting, but it also brings clarity. The house became a place of whispered apologies and halting attempts at reconciliation. My father came to me late one night, his eyes rimmed red, and confessed that he had suspected there was more to the family story than he had ever been told. I wanted to ask her, he admitted, voice trembling, but I was afraid of what I'd hear. I thought if I ignored it, maybe it would go away. His words struck me deeply, because I too had sometimes chosen comfort over confrontation. It's a pattern that many families fall into, choosing silence in the hope that it will keep the peace, never realizing that silence is itself a kind of decision, one that shapes the family as surely as any spoken word. One afternoon, while sorting through old papers in Evelyn's study, I found a letter she had written but never sent. It was addressed to Ava Harrington, the daughter of the business partner who had lost everything. The letter was filled with regret and a yearning for forgiveness, along with an explanation of the inheritance Evelyn hoped would in some small way make amends. I realized then that the next step was mine to take, to reach out to finish what Evelyn had begun, and to offer a hand to the person who had been most wronged. It was a daunting thought, but also a necessary one. I remembered a documentary I'd seen about two families brought together by a long-hidden adoption. Though the first meetings were awkward over time, the families grew into each other's lives, connected by truth and the courage to face it. As I prepared to contact Ava, I grappled with feelings of guilt and anxiety. Would she accept our apology? Would she want anything to do with us? Or would this reopening of old wounds only deepen her pain? I wrote and rewrote the message in my mind, trying to find words that felt honest but not presumptuous. We owe you more than an explanation, I rehearsed. We owe you a seat at the table that should have been yours all along. It was a hard lesson, one Evelyn had struggled with too, that sometimes making amends is not about erasing the past, but about taking responsibility in the present, no matter how late. Throughout those days, I watched my family slowly begin to open up. Martha invited Tyler for tea, something she hadn't done in years. My father and I shared long, quiet walks in the garden, occasionally touching on old memories and what might come next. There were still moments of awkwardness, moments when a word or glance brought the pain rushing back. But there was also relief in not having to pretend anymore, in being able to say, this is who we are, mistakes and all. It was the first real healing I'd seen in years, the kind that grows not from forgetting, but from understanding. One evening, as I watered Evelyn's roses, I thought about the price of silence. It's never just the loss of words, but the slow withering of trust, the distance that grows between people who love each other. I wrote in my journal, the truth is a door. We can be afraid to open it, but once we do, the air changes. We begin to breathe again. That became my lesson for the week, an understanding that healing begins the moment we let the truth move freely, even if it arrives with sorrow. As I sealed the letter to Ava and prepared to send it, I felt a gentle sense of purpose, a hope that in reaching out we might start to mend not just our own family, but the circle that had been broken so long ago. Tomorrow would be the day I met her face to face, carrying Evelyn's words and my own honest heart. I was nervous, of course. But as I watched the first stars appear in the evening sky, I knew this was the next step in a story that was finally bravely beginning again. The day I arranged to meet Ava Harrington, the world seemed to hold its breath with me. I spent the morning pacing the kitchen, reviewing Evelyn's letter and the legal documents one last time. My hands shook as I poured tea, and for a moment I considered calling the whole thing off, but I knew that would be another form of silence, another way of protecting myself at the expense of healing. When the doorbell finally rang, I took a deep breath and reminded myself this was about honoring not just Evelyn's wishes, but the man whose name she had written in sorrow for 40 years, and the daughter who had lost more than any of us could truly understand. Ava stood at the threshold, her posture guarded yet graceful eyes clear and searching. There was a resemblance to the photograph Evelyn had kept, the same steady gaze, the same hint of quiet strength. We exchanged polite words as I led her into the sunroom where I had arranged fresh roses and a plate of pastries Evelyn always served guests. "Thank you for coming," I managed the formality of my voice, betraying the storm inside me. Ava smiled, a little sad and a little curious. "I almost didn't," she admitted. "But when I heard your voice, I thought, maybe it's time." The simplicity of her honesty made the moment easier. Sometimes the hardest part of reconciliation is simply stepping into the same room. I explained everything as best I could, starting with Evelyn's confession, her regrets, and her wish to make amends, not only with words, but with action. Ava listened quiet and attentive, occasionally nodding as she read the letter. When I finished, she took a long, thoughtful breath before speaking. For years I wondered why my father's story ended the way it did, why his name was barely mentioned, why we never spoke about the early days of the business. My mother always said he was a dreamer, not a fighter. She smiled, softly remembering. But he never held grudges. "I think he'd want me to hear you out." Her willingness to listen despite the hurt was a lesson in grace I hoped I could someday match. We talked for hours about our families, about the weight of secrets, about the way the past can shape even the smallest details of our lives. I told her about Evelyn's quiet generosity, the way she had anonymously supported Ava's education and career. Ava was surprised but not angry. Maybe that's why doors always seem to open for me when I needed them most. She mused, a bittersweet smile on her lips. In that moment, I realized that healing is rarely simple. It grows in unexpected places like wildflowers after a storm. I thought of a friend who, after learning a difficult truth about her own adoption, had finally reached out to her birth mother. The first meeting was painful, but over time, they built something new. A relationship grounded not in erasing the past, but in accepting it. Ava and I agreed that the only way forward was together. "I can't change what happened," I said, "but I can promise to honor your father's part in our family story and to work with you to build something better." We reviewed the legal details, her rightful share in the company, the steps we would take to announce the change publicly. There was relief in those formalities, but the real work was quieter and more lasting. The work of rebuilding trust, of sharing memories, of creating new traditions that would outlast both our mothers and fathers. That evening after Ava left, I sat in the garden among Evelyn's roses, reflecting on what it means to truly heal. There's a temptation in the aftermath of family pain to seek justice in anger, or to close ourselves off to protect what remains. But Ava's grace reminded me that real reconciliation asks us to hold space for both pain and possibility. I wrote in my journal, "The past cannot be rewritten, but the future is still ours to shape." Healing begins the moment we stop running from what hurts and start reaching for what's possible. It was a lesson Evelyn had tried to teach all along, one I was only now beginning to understand. In the days that followed, Ava and I worked side by side, meeting with lawyers and board members, drafting statements facing both skepticism and support from those around us. There were moments of awkwardness, moments when the old pain flared up in unexpected ways. But each day we made a little more progress, a shared laugh, a story exchanged, a sense that we were not just repairing what had been broken, but building something entirely new. It reminded me of a story I'd once heard about two sisters estranged by a childhood rift who reconnected in adulthood to start a business. They didn't erase the past, but they honored it by building a future their parents would have been proud of. The lesson from those weeks was clear. It is possible to move from hatred to healing, from division to partnership, if we are willing to do the work of listening and forgiveness. It's rarely quick or easy, but it is always worth it. As summer settled over the estate and the roses came into bloom, I felt Evelyn's spirit close by, encouraging, hopeful, quietly cheering us on. One evening, Ava and I shared a quiet meal beneath the stars. "You know," she said, "I think our fathers would be proud not just for what we've built, but for the fact that we found a way to build it together." I smiled, feeling the truth of her words settle around us like the night air. The hardest chapters, it turns out, are sometimes the most beautiful when we finally allow ourselves to write them. With the first hints of a new beginning on the horizon, I knew the next part of our story was about to unfold, not defined by secrets, but by the hope and honesty we had finally chosen. Tomorrow we would face the world together, ready for whatever came next. The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings, signatures, and cautious conversations. Rebuilding the company's foundation was both daunting and strangely invigorating. Ava and I quickly discovered that change, even the kind rooted in honesty, rarely happens overnight. Some board members welcomed her with open arms, seeing the value in making things right, while others grumbled about airing old laundry and threatened to resign. At each turn, I remembered Evelyn's words, "If you build your life on a lie, you'll spend all your energy defending the illusion. But if you risk the truth, you might just set yourself free." We leaned into that advice, determined to write a new chapter, defined not by secrets, but by courage. Together, Ava and I re-examined every department, listening to longtime employees who had weathered both good times and bad. We invited open dialogue, encouraged questions, and started a tradition of weekly forums where anyone could speak honestly about the company's future. It wasn't easy. The initial weeks were marked by skepticism and painful revelations, including processes and policies that needed reform. But there were also moments of genuine hope. A junior manager who suggested a new community outreach program, a retired engineer who shared memories of working with Ava's father. I was reminded of a story in the news about a Fortune 500 company that completely overhauled its leadership after a whistleblower revealed years of misconduct. It was messy and public, but in time, the company emerged stronger with a renewed sense of purpose and pride. At home, the changes were equally profound. My father, once so resistant to any discussion of the past, began to show up for the small things, coffee in the kitchen, phone calls, just to ask how I was. There were still difficult conversations moments when old pain bubbled up, but we found a rhythm that allowed space for both honesty and forgiveness. Martha and Tyler, too, discovered new roles in the company and in our lives, contributing their strengths in ways that hadn't been possible when everything was shadowed by denial. I realized then that setting boundaries, choosing what to carry forward and what to lay down, was an act of love as much as any grand gesture. Boundaries weren't walls. They were gardens carefully tended where new growth could take root. As the company's story shifted in the public eye, I was invited to speak at a local business school about ethical leadership and the challenges of navigating family legacy. I shared our experience candidly, the cost of silence, the liberation that comes from facing hard truths, and the power of second chances. Several students approached me afterward, confiding their own struggles with family expectations and generational secrets. One young woman told me about her mother's journey to break free from a cycle of financial secrecy and how it changed not just their family, but their community. Hearing these stories, I realized we were part of a much larger tapestry, families everywhere, working to redefine legacy on their own terms. The lesson became clear with each passing day. Real legacy isn't about the assets listed in a will or the buildings that bear a family name. It's about the courage to choose truth to heal and to empower others to do the same. Ava and I made it a mission to create opportunities for those who had been overlooked, launching scholarships and mentorship programs in her father's memory. We wanted the new chapter of our family story to be one of inclusion, generosity, and transformation. Sometimes I caught myself wishing Evelyn could see it all, but then I'd remember her saying, "The best gardens are the ones you plant for the next generation to enjoy." There were setbacks, of course. Not everyone supported the new direction. A few shareholders sold their stakes in protest, and old family friends drifted away uncomfortable with the changes. Still, the momentum grew. Slowly, the narrative around our family shifted from scandal to redemption, from secrecy to strength. The local paper ran a feature about our turnaround, highlighting not just financial results, but the renewed culture of honesty and openness. I felt proud not just for myself and Ava, but for everyone who had risked discomfort to make things right. In quiet moments, I reflected on how much I'd changed. I was no longer the girl who preferred the safety of the garden, avoiding hard conversations for the sake of peace. I'd learned that facing the truth was the only way to build something that could last both in business and at home. I wrote in my journal, boundaries aren't about keeping people out. They're about knowing what to invite in. It was a lesson that would guide me long after the paperwork was signed and the public statements were made. As the first anniversary of Evelyn's passing approached, we organized a gathering in her memory, inviting employees, family, and community members who had been part of the journey. Under the shade of her beloved rose garden, Ava and I spoke together about our fathers, about the power of new beginnings, about the legacy we hoped to leave for those who would come after us. There was laughter and tears, but mostly there was gratitude. It struck me that true healing is never just personal. It ripples outward, touching lives we may never know. With the sun setting over the estate and the roses glowing in the evening light, I felt a deep peace, a sense that the hardest parts of our story had given way to something unexpectedly beautiful. As people drifted home, I knew the final chapter was about to begin, and that our story, like Evelyn's garden, would keep growing for years to come. As the anniversary of Evelyn's passing arrived, I found myself once again in her garden, surrounded by the soft fragrance of Queen Anne roses. The petals caught the late afternoon light, pink and gold, as if the garden itself remembered every joy and every sorrow that had passed beneath its boughs. In this peaceful space, the story of our family felt whole roots tangled with secrets, blossoms bold with new beginnings. Looking back on the year, I saw not only the pain and reckoning, but also the quiet acts of bravery, opening the letter, facing the truth, reaching out to Ava, inviting forgiveness, setting boundaries, and building a legacy on honesty instead of illusion. Our journey had been anything but simple. There were days when I doubted myself, when the weight of Evelyn's trust and the eyes of my family nearly broke me. But each step, meeting Ava, hearing her story, choosing partnership over pride, reminded me that healing isn't a single moment. It's a process, one rooted in listening, humility, and the courage to begin again. I thought about all the families across America who struggle with legacies both beautiful and bruised, and I realized that what matters isn't how we start, but how bravely we choose to grow beyond what came before. I remembered the difficult talks with my father, the slow return of laughter between Martha and Tyler, the company's transformation from guarded silences to open, hopeful forums. Every part of this journey carried its own lesson. Secrets we learned do not keep us safe, they keep us small. Boundaries are not for shutting people out, but for making room for better things to bloom. And legacy is not a treasure we inherit, but a story we choose to keep writing together. One evening after the gathering, for Evelyn, Ava, and I lingered beneath the roses. The conversation turned to the future, not just of the business, but of our own families and the communities we now called home. "Do you think the hard parts ever truly end?" she asked. I smiled, thinking of all we had weathered. "I don't think they end," I replied. "But I do think with time and care, the beauty always outgrows the pain." The moon rose over the garden, casting everything in a gentle silver light. In that moment, I felt Evelyn's presence, her faith in new beginnings, her belief in the second bloom. If you've made it this far with me, maybe you carry a family secret or a heavy truth of your own. Maybe you've stood at a crossroads, unsure if you have the strength to be the one who breaks a silence, forgives a hurt, or plants something new. If so, let our story be a reminder the bravest thing you can do is start. Tell the truth even when your voice trembles. Set boundaries even when others resist. Choose compassion even when the past is hard to forgive. Healing may take time, but every step you take changes not just your life, but the lives of those who follow. Before you go, I'd love to hear your story. What legacy are you building? What truth are you learning to share? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your words might be the courage someone else needs tonight. And if you found meaning or hope in this journey, please like, subscribe, and join our growing community. Together, let's keep planning new traditions, one honest story at a time. Because as Evelyn taught me, roses will always bloom again, especially when we have the courage to tend the garden.